This is the story of ICICI Venture, a firm whose history is, in many ways, the history of venture capital in India itself. Long before startups and unicorns entered the national conversation, this institution was writing the country's very first venture checks, backing unknown engineers and founders when almost no one else would. It began as a bold experiment by two state-backed giants, grew into India's largest private equity firm, and along the way trained a generation of investors who would go on to shape the entire industry. To understand it, we have to travel back to an India that had almost no risk capital at all. To appreciate what ICICI Venture did, you have to picture India in the late 1980s. It was still a closed, tightly controlled economy, years before the reforms of 1991 would open the country to the world. For an entrepreneur with nothing but an idea and ambition, there was almost nowhere to turn. Banks lent only against hard collateral, land, machinery, assets, not against vision or intellectual property. The concept of an investor who would take an equity stake in a young and proven company, share its risk, and bet on its future simply did not exist in any organized form. India had brilliant engineers and would-be founders, but no ecosystem to fund them. That was the void this story begins in. In 1988, that void began to close. Two of India's most powerful financial institutions, ICICI, then a development finance institution, and the Unit Trust of India, the giant state-run mutual fund, came together to create something the country had never seen, a dedicated venture capital company. They called it the Technology Development and Information Company of India, or TDICI. Set up as an equal joint venture and based in Bangalore, the emerging heart of Indian technology, TDICI carried a mandate that sounded almost radical at the time, to provide risk capital to young, technology-driven businesses. It is widely recognized that organized venture capital in India effectively began in 1988 with the birth of this single institution. What made TDICI so unusual was its very purpose. This was not another lender demanding collateral and guarantees. Its job was to do the opposite, to put equity capital into fledgling companies, to take on the risk that banks refused, and to back the intangible promise of technology and talent. In a country where the very idea was foreign, TDICI had to invent the practice of Indian venture capital almost from first principles. How to evaluate a startup, how to price risk, how to structure a deal, how to nurture a company after investing. There was no local playbook to follow. Every check it wrote was, in a sense, an experiment in a discipline India had never practiced before. To do the work, TDICI launched its first fund, known as VECAUS, the Venture Capital Unit Scheme. By today's standards, the amounts were tiny, around 20 crore rupees to be spread across dozens of companies. This modest pool was set to work backing roughly 37 to 40 small and medium-sized enterprises, managed by a lean team of just a handful of investment professionals. It was a shoestring operation with an outsized mission. Consider what that meant in practice. 7 or so people, deploying what would today be a rounding error, trying to seed an entire asset class in a country that had never had one. Each investment was a leap of faith into businesses and sectors that had never before received this kind of capital. But from these small beginnings, TDICI would help fund some of the earliest names in what became India's technology and pharmaceutical boom. The very first project TDICI funded was Kale Consultants, a young software company, a fitting choice for an institution built to back Indian technology. Soon after came one of its most famous early bets. Around 1988 and 1989, a small software firm called Mastek decided to move into building its own products, and it received its first venture funding from TDICI to the tune of roughly 10 crore rupees. For a company of that size, in that era, this was transformational capital. These were not safe, established businesses. They were founders with conviction and little else, exactly the kind of risk that TDICI had been created to take, and that no traditional lender in India would have touched. TDICI's early portfolio reads like a roll call of India's first technology generation. Alongside Mastek, it backed companies such as Microland and VXL, and its bets extended beyond pure software into businesses like the pharmaceutical company Sun Pharmaceuticals and a range of small industrial firms. Several of these companies went on to list publicly, delivering real successes and, just as importantly, proving that venture capital could actually work in India. This mattered enormously. Every successful exit was evidence, to skeptical banks, bureaucrats, and future investors, that betting on ideas was not reckless but rational. For a whole cohort of entrepreneurs building the country's software and industrial future, TDICI was the institution that took the first chance on them. It was, quite literally, helping to finance the dawn of India's technology industry, one small check at a time. But being first meant learning by trial and error, and TDICI's early years were far from flawless. As a pioneer, it sometimes fell in love with interesting technology without paying enough attention to whether a business could truly make money. Its involvement in the harder work of company building, shaping strategy, developing markets, recruiting leaders, was often limited. In other words, it was still discovering what great venture investing actually required. These were expensive lessons, but they were also foundational. The mistakes made in these first funds taught the Indian venture industry what worked and what did not, and the professionals who cut their teeth here would carry those hard-won lessons into the firms they built for decades to come. By the late 1990s, the experiment had matured, and its ownership was about to change. In 1998, ICICI bought out the Unit Trust of India's stake, making the venture business a wholly owned subsidiary. The institution born as TDICI was renamed ICICI Venture Funds Management Company. It was more than a change of name. It marked a transition from a state-backed technology experiment into a professional, ambitious investment firm, one now firmly under the wing of what would soon become one of India's most powerful private sector financial groups. The stage was set for a dramatic second act, and for the arrival of the leader who would define it. In 2001, Renuka Ramnath took the helm as managing director and chief executive, and she transformed the firm. Under her leadership, ICICI Venture made a decisive strategic pivot. Around 2002, it moved away from small, early-stage technology bets toward larger, later-stage private equity investments in more established companies. And crucially, it shifted from investing mainly its own parent's capital to raising and managing large third-party funds from outside investors, the model that defines modern private equity. This was a bold reinvention, turning a legacy venture arm into a serious, institutional private equity powerhouse, and it would soon make ICICI Venture the largest firm of its kind in the country. The results were spectacular. In 2003, ICICI Venture put about $8 million into a small multiplex operator called PVR for a 38% stake. It helped fuel the multiplex revolution that transformed how Indians watched movies, took PVR to a public listing in 2005, and roughly quadrupled its money. Between 2003 and 2008, Ramnath raised and deployed the $250 million India Advantage Fund, returning more than 3 times investors' capital. There were bold bets on the low-cost airline Air Deccan, on the media company Infomedia, and on the water technology firm VECAUS. In just a few years, the firm's assets under management rocketed from around $200 million to over $2.5 billion. And its legacy portfolio would go on to return roughly 3.5 times the money entrusted to it. ICICI Venture had become, by some distance, the largest private equity firm in India. By 2009, Renuka Ramnath was ready for her own chapter. She left to found Multiple's alternate asset management, starting with a fund of around $400 million and building it into one of India's most respected independent private equity firms, today managing roughly $3 billion. But she was only the most prominent example of a much broader pattern. Over the decades, ICICI Venture became a kind of training academy for Indian private equity and venture capital. The investors who learned their craft inside this firm went on to lead or found a remarkable number of the funds that power Indian finance today. Its influence radiated far beyond its own balance sheet. Today, ICICI Venture has evolved into a diversified alternative asset management platform, investing not just in private equity, but across real estate, structured and mezzanine finance, and special situations. It is led by Managing Director and Chief Executive Puneet Nanda, who took charge in 2020, bringing deep experience from the wider ICICI group. The firm that began with a single 20 crore rupee fund now manages capital across multiple strategies and economic cycles, continuing to back Indian businesses more than 3 decades after it wrote its first check. It is no longer the scrappy pioneer of 1988, but a mature institution that helped build the very industry it still competes in. Step back, and the scale of the journey is remarkable. Since its founding in 1988, ICICI Venture has invested in more than 600 businesses across nearly every sector, geography, and economic cycle India has passed through. Over its lifetime, it has managed something on the order of $5 billion in assets across all its strategies, from those first tiny venture bets to billion-dollar private equity and real estate funds. Few investment firms anywhere can claim to have been present at the very creation of their industry and to still be standing and thriving decades later. It survived the collapse of the technology bubble, the global financial crisis, and wave after wave of change in Indian finance. ICICI Venture was there before Indian venture capital had a name, and it remains a major force long after. So what is the legacy of ICICI Venture? It is, quite simply, the institution that opened the door. It proved that in India, too, you could back ideas rather than assets, that risk capital could fund a technology revolution, and that an unknown founder with conviction deserved a check. It made pioneering mistakes and learned from them, reinvented itself into a private equity giant, and seeded the talent that built much of the modern Indian investment landscape. From a small joint venture in Bangalore in 1988 to a diversified platform today, its real monument is the entire industry that now exists because it went first. In the story of Indian venture capital, ICICI Venture is where the story begins. Thanks for